In the swamps of southern Louisiana, there's a piece of land that locals still won't talk about. It's been over a century since the last member of the Thibodeaux family disappeared from those marshlands, but the stories persist, whispered tales of a patriarch who decided his bloodline was too pure to dilute with outsiders, who made a decision so monstrous that it would curse 4 generations of his descendants. In 1886, a traveling preacher stumbled upon something in those bayous that made him flee to the nearest sheriff, stammering about a family that had turned itself inside out, where brothers and sisters produced children together by their father's command, where the family tree had become so tangled that children didn't know if their siblings were also their cousins, their aunts, or their own parents. What investigators eventually uncovered wasn't just a crime. It was multi-generational experiment in human degradation, orchestrated by one man's twisted vision of dynastic purity. This is the story of how one father's obsession with keeping his bloodline untainted created a living nightmare that would span nearly 50 years. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The patriarch's name was Étienne Thibodeaux, a French Creole landowner who settled in the Louisiana Bayou country sometime around 1860. He'd come from old money, from a family that prided itself on its pure French lineage, untainted by what they considered inferior blood. When Étienne married and had children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, he became obsessed with the idea that his family's superiority would be diluted if his children married outsiders. He'd seen other prominent Creole families lose their status, their wealth, their identity by marrying into Anglo families or, God forbid, mixing with people of color in a region where racial lines were already blurred. So Étienne made a decision that would doom his entire line. He would keep the bloodline pure by keeping it in the family, completely in the family. When his eldest daughter Marie reached marriageable age in 1875, Étienne didn't look for suitors. Instead, he informed her that she would be wed to her younger brother Antoine in everything but legal name. There would be no official marriage, no church ceremony, no records that outsiders could examine. But in the eyes of God and family, Étienne declared they were husband and wife. Marie was 16, Antoine was 14, and neither of them had any choice in the matter. What Étienne created wasn't just incest. It was a systematic breeding program designed to keep his bloodline from ever leaving the family property. The plantation became a prison. The family became an experiment. And the children born from these unions would carry genetic consequences that would become more visible and more horrifying with each passing generation. Étienne Thibodeaux ruled his plantation with absolute authority, and in the isolated Bayou country of 1870s Louisiana, there was no one to challenge him. The nearest town was 15 miles away through treacherous swampland, accessible only by boat or on horseback through paths that Étienne controlled. He employed no outside workers, relying instead on family labor and the absolute obedience of his children. When Marie gave birth to her first child by her brother Antoine in 1876, the baby was born with a cleft palate and eyes that didn't track properly, early warning signs of the genetic catastrophe that inbreeding would bring. But Étienne saw only the continuation of his pure bloodline. He named the child Étienne Jr., ensuring his legacy would carry forward through this twisted family tree. The system Étienne established was brutally simple. His daughters would bear children with their brothers, and those children, when they came of age, would be paired with their own siblings or cousins to produce the next generation. Anyone who resisted was beaten, starved, or locked in the plantation's old slave quarters until they complied. Étienne justified this horror with a perverse religious philosophy he'd constructed, claiming that the Bible's early families had married within their own bloodlines, that Abraham's wife Sarah was his half-sister, that purity before God required purity of blood. He held daily prayer sessions where he preached this twisted gospel to his captive congregation, reinforcing that what happened on the plantation was holy, ordained, and secret. The outside world wouldn't understand. The outside world was corrupted. Only the Thibodeaux family remained pure. By 1880, the plantation housed 3 generations living under Étienne's iron rule. Marie and Antoine had produced 4 children, all showing varying degrees of physical and cognitive impairment. Étienne's second daughter, Celeste, had been paired with her cousin, the son of Étienne's brother, who had briefly lived on the plantation before disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The genetic damage was becoming impossible to ignore. Children were born deaf, blind, with twisted limbs and faces that didn't quite form correctly. Some died within days of birth. Others survived, but would never develop beyond the mental capacity of toddlers. Yet Étienne pressed forward, convinced that these were merely imperfections being bred out, that eventually his program would produce a generation of genetically superior Thibodeaux children. The reality was the opposite. Each generation was weaker, sicker, more damaged than the last. The isolation Étienne maintained was nearly perfect. Supply runs to town were made by Étienne himself, or his eldest son, who'd been so thoroughly indoctrinated that he would never betray the family's secrets. The children rarely left the plantation grounds. They were taught to fear outsiders, told that the world beyond the bayou was filled with people who would destroy them if they learned the truth. And in a dark, twisted way, Étienne was right. The outside world would have been horrified by what was happening on that plantation. But his success in maintaining secrecy meant that the horror continued year after year, generation after generation, with no one to stop it. By 1886, the Thibodeaux plantation had become something that shouldn't exist in the natural world. A closed genetic loop that was slowly collapsing in on itself. The 4th generation was being born, and the children of this generation were so severely impaired that many couldn't walk, speak, or feed themselves. Étienne was now in his 60s, his hair white and his body failing, but his iron grip on the family never weakened. He'd outlived his wife, who had died under circumstances that family members whispered about, but never openly discussed. Some said she'd taken her own life after watching what her husband had done to their children. Others claimed Étienne had killed her when she threatened to flee to the authorities. The truth died with her, buried in the family cemetery on the plantation grounds alongside dozens of infants who hadn't survived their first year. The breaking point came in the spring of 1886, when a traveling Methodist preacher named Reverend Thomas Blackwell lost his way in the bayou during a storm. Seeking shelter, he followed lamplight to the Thibodeaux plantation and knocked on the door, expecting the hospitality that rural custom demanded. What he found inside would haunt him for the rest of his life. The family that greeted him moved strangely, spoke in ways that suggested severe cognitive impairment, and looked at him with a mixture of fear and confusion that seemed disproportionate to a simple request for shelter. As Reverend Blackwell was given a meal in the main house, he noticed children peering at him from doorways, children with misshapen heads, with eyes set too far apart or too close together, with limbs that bent at wrong angles. When Blackwell asked Étienne about the children's conditions, the old man's response chilled him to the bone. Étienne, perhaps sensing his death approaching and feeling a need to confess, or perhaps simply so convinced of his righteousness that he saw no reason to hide, told Blackwell everything. He explained his breeding program, his philosophy of blood purity, his belief that he was creating a dynasty that would outlast the corrupted world around it. He showed Blackwell the family records he'd meticulously kept, a genealogical chart that looped back on itself in ways that made Blackwell physically ill to examine. Brother, sister unions producing children who then bred with their own siblings, cousins producing offspring who were then paired with their parents' siblings, a genetic tangle so complex and so horrifying that it took Blackwell several minutes to even comprehend what he was looking at. Blackwell maintained his composure long enough to accept Étienne's offer of a bed for the night, but he didn't sleep. He lay awake in that house of horrors, listening to the sounds of children crying, of adults moving through hallways with shuffling, uncertain gaits, of Étienne's voice murmuring prayers in French that sounded more like incantations than appeals to any Christian god. At first light, Blackwell fled. He rode his horse through the bayou at a pace that was dangerous in that treacherous terrain, driven by a desperation to escape what he'd witnessed and a moral obligation to report it. When he reached the sheriff's office in the nearest town, he was nearly incoherent, his story so extreme that the sheriff initially dismissed it as fever dreams or the ravings of a man who'd gotten lost in the swamp and let his imagination run wild. It took Reverend Blackwell 3 days of persistent pleading before the sheriff agreed to investigate. Even then, the lawman was skeptical, convinced they'd find nothing more than a family of isolated bayou dwellers who'd perhaps married cousins, distasteful but not uncommon in rural Louisiana. What the sheriff and his 2 deputies discovered when they finally made their way to the Thibodeaux plantation in late April of 1886 exceeded anything Blackwell had described. The scene that greeted them was like something from a medieval nightmare transplanted into the American South. In the yard, children with severe deformities crawled in the dirt, unable to stand. Inside the main house, they found 3 generations living in squalor. The genetic damage so severe in the youngest members that some appeared barely human, their skulls misshapen, their features distorted by the accumulated mutations of sustained inbreeding. Étienne Thibodeaux showed no shame when confronted by the authorities. He invited them to examine his records, proudly displaying the genealogical charts that documented 4 generations of systematic incest. He explained his methodology with the detachment of a scientist discussing an experiment, describing which pairings had produced the strongest offspring, and which combinations had resulted in children too damaged to continue the line. The sheriff, a hardened man who'd seen violence and death throughout his career, later testified that he'd never encountered anything that shook him as deeply as Étienne's calm recitation of his breeding program. This wasn't a man driven by lust or momentary madness. This was someone who'd constructed an entire philosophical and theological framework to justify the systematic destruction of his own bloodline. The legal complications were immediate and profound. Louisiana law in 1886 had statutes against incest, but they were rarely enforced and typically applied only to direct parent-child relationships. The web of incestuous relationships within the Thibodeaux family was so complex that prosecutors struggled to determine which specific acts to charge. Moreover, many of the victims were also perpetrators. Children who'd been abused had grown up to abuse the next generation, making the distinction between victim and criminal hopelessly blurred. And there was the question of what to do with the children, some of whom were so severely impaired that they would require lifelong institutional care, and others who'd been so warped by their upbringing that they might never be able to function in normal society. Étienne himself seemed almost eager for prosecution, viewing it as an opportunity to defend his beliefs before a wider audience. He hired lawyers and prepared to argue that his actions, while unconventional, were protected by religious freedom and property rights. His children were his to manage as he saw fit, he claimed, and the state had no authority to interfere with how a man ran his household. His attorneys, horrified by their client but bound by professional obligation, tried to mount a defense based on insanity, arguing that no sane man would have done what Étienne did. But Étienne rejected this strategy, insisting he was perfectly rational, and that history would vindicate his experiment in bloodline purity. The trial, when it finally began in the fall of 1886, became a spectacle that drew journalists from across the South, all eager to report on the most disturbing family crime in American history. The trial of Étienne Thibodeaux began in October of 1886 in a courthouse that was packed beyond capacity, with spectators morbidly curious to hear the details of what newspapers were calling the Bayou breeding horror. The prosecution presented medical testimony from doctors who'd examined the Thibodeaux children, describing genetic abnormalities so severe that they'd never encountered anything comparable in their careers. Cleft palates, microcephaly, severe intellectual disabilities, blindness, deafness, skeletal deformities. The list of afflictions was staggering. One doctor testified that he'd examined a 10-year-old boy with the cognitive capacity of a 6-month-old infant, unable to speak, walk, or recognize his own reflection. Another described twin girls who'd been born fused at the hip, a rare condition made more likely by the genetic bottleneck Étienne had created. The most disturbing testimony came from the victims themselves, those few who were mentally capable of understanding what had happened to them and articulating it to strangers. A 19-year-old woman named Marguerite, the granddaughter of Étienne through his daughter Marie, took the stand and described growing up believing that being forced to have children with her brother was normal, that this was simply what families did. She spoke of being 12 years old and being told by her grandfather that it was time for her to fulfill her duty to the bloodline. She described the confusion, the pain, and eventually the numb acceptance that came from years of abuse with no escape. Her testimony was so graphic and disturbing that the judge cleared the courtroom of women and children, allowing only adult men to hear the remainder. Even the hardened journalists present struggled to report on what was said without violating standards of decency. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Étienne's defense team attempted to paint him as a victim of his own delusions, a man whose mind had been broken by isolation and obsession. They brought in alienists, the psychiatrists of the 1880s, who testified that Étienne displayed signs of moral insanity, a condition they claimed left him unable to distinguish right from wrong despite being otherwise rational. But Étienne undermined his own defense at every turn, interrupting testimony to correct factual errors, insisting that his mental faculties were perfectly sound, and that his actions were the result of careful planning and philosophical conviction, not madness. He delivered a closing statement that lasted over 3 hours, in which he argued that selective breeding was the future of humanity, that the weak and corrupted bloodlines of the world were dragging mankind down, and that his experiment had simply moved too quickly, that given more generations, the genetic problems would have resolved themselves and produced a superior line of human beings. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Étienne Thibodeaux was found guilty on 14 counts of incest, rape, and child abuse, a fraction of the crimes he'd actually committed, but enough to ensure he would never leave prison. He was sentenced to life in the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, where he would die 3 years later, never showing a moment of remorse for what he'd done. But the conviction of the patriarch didn't solve the fundamental problem: what to do with the dozens of damaged survivors he'd left behind, and how to prevent the cycle from continuing. The aftermath of the Thibodeaux case presented Louisiana authorities with a humanitarian crisis they were completely unprepared to handle. There were 43 surviving members of the family, ranging from infants to adults in their 30s, and nearly all of them required some form of institutional care. The most severely impaired were sent to the Louisiana State Insane Asylum in Jackson, a facility already overcrowded and understaffed, ill-equipped to deal with patients whose disabilities were unlike anything the medical establishment had encountered. The children who were mentally capable of learning were placed in orphanages, but even these higher-functioning survivors struggled enormously. They'd been raised in complete isolation, with no understanding of currency, formal education, or social norms beyond the twisted rules of the plantation. Some would never successfully integrate into society. The institutional response revealed the limitations of 19th century understanding of both genetics and psychology. Doctors treating the Thibodeaux survivors had no framework for understanding the specific damage caused by multi-generational inbreeding. They recognized that something was terribly wrong, but their explanations ranged from divine punishment to degeneration of the blood, pre-scientific concepts that offered no real insight or treatment options. The psychological trauma was even more poorly understood. These weren't people who'd experienced a discrete traumatic event. They'd been born into trauma, raised in it, knew nothing else. Modern concepts like complex PTSD or developmental trauma wouldn't exist for another century. The doctors and caretakers of 1886 did their best, but their best was woefully inadequate. Some of the survivors did manage to build relatively normal lives, though always haunted by their origins. Several of the women were eventually married to men who either didn't know their history or were willing to overlook it, producing children who, mercifully, showed no obvious signs of genetic damage when bred with outside bloodlines. But the stigma followed them. When the full story of the Thibodeaux case became public knowledge, anyone known to be from that family became a pariah. Some changed their names and moved to distant states, severing all connections to Louisiana and their past. Others lived out their lives in institutions, never leaving the walls that had become their new prison after escaping the plantation. The plantation itself was burned to the ground in 1887, though whether by authorities or by vigilantes remains unclear. Local residents wanted all physical trace of what had happened there erased from the landscape, as if destroying the buildings could somehow undo the horror that had occurred within them. The land was eventually sold off in parcels, and today, if you know where to look, you can still find the remnants of the Thibodeaux cemetery deep in the bayou. Weathered headstones marking the graves of dozens of infants and children who didn't survive their first years. The dates on those stones tell their own story. Clusters of deaths, years where multiple children died within weeks of each other. Physical evidence of how unstable and fragile the inbred line had become. Nature has reclaimed most of the property now, the bayou swallowing up the roads and foundations, covering the crime scene with decades of growth. But the genetic legacy of Étienne Thibodeaux's experiment persists in medical literature, studied as a cautionary example of what happens when human reproduction becomes isolated from the broader gene pool. Today, the Thibodeaux case exists mostly in obscure legal records and medical journals, a footnote in the history of American crime that most people have never heard of. The family name itself has virtually disappeared from Louisiana, the last known descendants having either died out or successfully hidden their connection to that dark chapter. But the case left ripples that extended far beyond one family's destruction. It became a reference point in early debates about eugenics, cited by both proponents and opponents of selective breeding programs. Those who supported eugenics pointed to the Thibodeaux disaster as evidence that breeding needed to be scientifically managed by the state. Those who opposed it saw the same case as proof that tampering with human reproduction led only to suffering and horror. Neither side seemed to grasp the real lesson, that Étienne Thibodeaux's crime wasn't that he practiced eugenics incorrectly, but that he treated human beings as breeding stock at all. The psychological legacy is harder to quantify, but no less real. Therapists working with survivors of familial abuse occasionally encounter cases that echo the Thibodeaux pattern. Isolated families where multi-generational incest has created closed systems of abuse that persist for decades. These cases rarely reach the public eye, protected by the same isolation and secrecy that shielded the Thibodeaux plantation for so long. When they are discovered, investigators often find that the perpetrators, like Étienne, have constructed elaborate justifications for their actions, religious beliefs, conspiracy theories about the outside world, or philosophical frameworks that recast abuse as something noble or necessary. The human capacity for self-justification is limitless, and predators are endlessly creative in finding reasons why their victims deserve what happens to them. What makes the Thibodeaux case particularly haunting is its deliberateness. This wasn't abuse born of passion or impulse. It was systematic, planned, executed across decades with the cold precision of a scientific experiment. Étienne kept records. He tracked bloodlines. He made breeding decisions based on which combinations produced the outcomes he desired. He turned his own children into laboratory subjects, and his plantation into a breeding facility, all in service of an ideology that was monstrous from its inception. The fact that he never wavered, never expressed doubt or remorse, never acknowledged the suffering he'd caused, makes him one of the most chilling figures in American criminal history. He died in prison believing he'd been right all along, that the world simply wasn't ready to understand his vision. The story of the Thibodeaux breeding cult is not one that offers easy lessons or comforting conclusions. It's simply a dark testament to what human beings are capable of when they place ideology above empathy, when they view other people as means to an end rather than as individuals with their own dignity and rights. Étienne Thibodeaux destroyed his bloodline in the name of preserving it, created generations of suffering in pursuit of an imaginary purity, and left behind only wreckage, damaged bodies, broken minds, and a legacy of pain that echoed through decades. The Bayou has swallowed the physical evidence of his crimes, but the story persists, a reminder that the worst monsters aren't always the ones who act on impulse. Sometimes they're the ones who plan carefully, who believe deeply in their own righteousness, who never doubt for a moment that the horror they're inflicting is justified. Those are the ones we should fear most, because those are the ones who teach others to follow their example, spreading darkness across generations until someone finally finds the courage to drag it into the light.